The improvements made between Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake were rather linear. The experience was expanded and deepened where possible while still working on the same MSX2 hardware. However, for Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation, the evolution would be more lateral. In my video on Metal Gear 1 and 2, which I recommend you watch before this one, I likened Metal Gear's timeline to a web of themes, mechanics and stories. Metal Gear Solid, with its lateral move in iteration, would be where the web really started to get spun, turning what was a thread into a crisscrossing of convoluted continuity. Metal Gear Solid invests way more in character, narrative and cinematic technique while keeping an interactive base in step with the original Metal Gear games. This shift in priority and evolution could seem sudden going right from MG2 to MGS1, but if you look at some of the other titles Kojima worked on, it makes more sense. Snatcher from 1988 was a cyberpunk adventure game which centers on the arc of main character Gillian, as he's wrapped up in a conspiracy to replace humans with androids. Policenauts in '94 was also a science fiction adventure game, continuing to concentrate on character interaction and writing. These two titles also show an interest in looking forward with radical ideas. Kojima loves to dive deep on hypothetical futures, whether in regards to conflict, crises, or just technology. Metal Gear 1 and 2 did allow for some of that, but Snatcher and Policenauts, less constrained by interaction, were able to let his mind run free more in that regard, which shines through in Metal Gear Solid. Metal Gear Solid initially began development on the 3DO after Kojima and his team had finished a port of Policenauts to the console. However, as the 3DO proved a failure, development shifted to the PlayStation. During production, a big focus was put on realism and immersion, with consultancy given on weapon/combat and a greater focus, as mentioned, on the story. At the same time, Metal Gear Solid marks Kojima's first collaboration with two important people, concept artist Yoji Shinkawa and writer Tomokazu Fukushima. Shinkawa would finally give the series' cast definitive identities and silhouettes of their own, and although I can't exactly pinpoint what Fukushima brought to the writing, it's a notable improvement from this game onwards, and in some ways falls off again once he departs the series, so he'd prove to be incredibly important to the process. Metal Gear Solid would become a revelation to the games industry. Selling 12 million copies in its original PlayStation incarnation, it was the confluence of a unique, cinematically minded voice in video games and that precious Z-axis. Its mature, well-paced story, distinct characters, and fleshed-out stealth mechanics create a totally individual expression of interactive art. Its influence carries on 25 years later, and is where Kojima's wholehearted exploration of daddy issues would start. So let's get stuck in. Much like Metal Gear 1 and 2, Metal Gear Solid begins with a monologue from Snake's superior explaining the mission and objective. Shadow Moses, a nuclear disposal facility on Alaska, has been taken over by a group of terrorists, leading an army of genetically modified soldiers. They're demanding the remains of Big Boss, who Snake's killed twice already, saying that if they don't get them within 24 hours, they'll fire a nuke. Snake's objectives are to rescue the chief of DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, Donald Anderson, and President Baker of ArmsTech, a weapons manufacturer. Snake's also to look into whether the terrorists actually have the capability to fire a nuclear weapon. While this intro is structurally similar to previous entries, it differs via presentation, most notably the use of the camera within 3D space. Metal Gear 2 had to resort to vignettes to communicate the theming and scene setting of the script, while here it can get right amongst the details. Movements are slow and creeping as though floating through the same water as the submarine and later SDV that's transporting Snake to Shadow Moses. This approach also builds intrigue as you wait for what the next frame will bring, how much will be given away. At the same time, as Colonel Campbell begins to detail the former Foxhound terrorist members, the point of view becomes less objective, shifting to match Snake, preparing you to control him, syncing up with the more personal nature of the exposition at this point, as Snake used to be a part of Foxhound himself like the terrorists. We go from seeing him up close in the SDV to seeing the SDV's, or his, direct first-person view as he navigates the underwater caverns. Then finally, as Campbell mentions Liquid Snake, the terrorist leader, Solid Snake exits the pod, and we see him freely for the first time. As he's told that this is a solo assignment and that there will be no official support, the camera posts up deep below him, emphasizing the isolation Snake feels and faces as he floats to the surface, soon to begin the operation. The camera is immediately keying us into motivation, character, and mood, understanding its own power as a purveyor of perspective. It's helped along by the voice acting. Campbell is notably grizzled and wizened, a voice that feels authoritative and trustworthy, taking the game's subject matter and setting seriously enough to sell the player on it.
Was attacked and captured by Next Generation Special Forces, being led by members of Foxhound.
Finally, there's the translation of cinematic standards, like the letterboxing of the frame and performer credits in the intro sequence. These things all made MGS stick out as a markedly more cinematic experience than other games at the time. It was, and still is, exciting to see. Important thematic threads begin here as well, like the lack of support Snake can expect being emphasized, and Liquid having the same code name, referencing a different type of code, as Snake. This then leads us to the title screen, which sees scrolls of what could be code or more abstractly information washing over each other before Snake himself, finally unmasked, fades into the middle of it all, a provocative image that will come to be more appropriate as we progress. From the main menu, you can view different briefing sessions. These help you get greater context for the story and a better understanding of relationships established in the previous two games, like that between Snake and Campbell. The briefings are essentially radio plays. They're not just prescriptive information dumps, but further insights into these people, what drives them, and in-universe history. You learn that Snake is being blackmailed into participating in the mission, and that Campbell seems pretty comfortable doing the blackmailing. The Colonel also brings a thread from Metal Gear 2 back up. In that game, Big Boss posited that soldiers only belong on the battlefield, that they'll always need a war to fight to feel purpose. Snake said he'd prove him wrong, and yet here he is, still returning for this meeting. You also learn more about Liquid Snake, how he fought in the Gulf War, and later for a British intelligence agency. Finally, a comparison is made between the visage of the two Snakes, with this resemblance highlighted by the presence of fingerprints in Liquid's little biography screen. If you view all these briefings, or at the very least the Liquid one, you hear Snake chop his hair off, no longer matching the other Snake so closely. These are all interesting things that help key you into the game's direction and focus, but even here I still think the most important part are the visuals. These are viewed through a surveillance camera, one that in many cases you can actually control, panning across and zooming in and out of the painted animations. Additionally, Snake is completely naked. He's being monitored by the people who should trust him and is vulnerable. There's a voyeuristic quality to the tapes that informs how Snake will be treated, an incredibly crucial aspect of the game's thematic exploration. And hey, would you look at that, after 40 minutes of listening to conversations, you can actually start playing the game. We see Snake swim to the foot of Shadow Moses. As he does so, you hear Gaelic chants emphasizing his humanity before they fade to make way for something much more frigid and detached. As the camera glides over this initial floor, juxtaposing Snake and his mission, we see Liquid tell the Genome soldiers to keep an eye out for Snake, riding the same elevator we'll take to get to Shadow Moses proper. Despite the new third dimension, Metal Gear Solid doesn't differ too much in core gameplay from Metal Gear 2, thanks to the top-down perspective and fixed camera angles. You only really take full advantage of that with first-person mode. This lets you look around and enhance your ability to observe guard layouts and patterns, which is the most important aspect of performing stealth. You also enter first-person view when entering a crawl space, the radar disappearing. In my Metal Gear 2 video, I mentioned how the radar can be kind of omniscient, and so some concessions need to be made so you don't become too reliant on it. Taking away the radar when in a crawl space is a great decision, as it creates distinct advantages and disadvantages to hiding away like this. It adds risk and tension to gameplay in a very compelling way. Another way to take advantage of the 3D is to lean against walls to swing the camera in front of Snake, giving you a view of what's up ahead, handy for when guards are not quite on the radar yet. Getting used to these 3D features is pretty easy thanks to the design of this area. It uses a very simple grid, something easy to digest and figure out, so that you can acclimatize yourself with gameplay. This grid neatly splits up guards so you rarely have to deal with more than one at a time, and also gives you some breathing room as each box presents an opportunity to break line of sight and find a hiding spot should you get caught. This room is self-contained and straightforward, proving to be a great place to experiment and learn about guard behavior at its base level. Snake calls the elevator and hops on. As he removes the diving suit, you can't help but wonder just what he looks like, as we saw Liquid earlier. The game knows this, obscuring his face until he rises up. We see the distinctly shorter and darker hair, with the title drop emphasizing his codename, Solid. Despite the effort to differentiate the two here, the camera deliberately follows Solid much like it did Liquid earlier when he was on the elevator. There are still connections between them being purposefully highlighted. Liquid leaves in a Russian-timed helicopter to investigate word of 2 F-16s flying overhead, as Snake is introduced to Mei Ling, a data processing specialist who designed the codec and Soliton radar system. The DARPA chief should show up on the radar as a green dot, so that becomes your first objective. The mechanical breadth of stealth expands greatly in this area as a ton of new obstacles are utilized and a more convoluted design is employed. There are 3 potential entrances to the facility, one of which is on a different level. There are security cameras, guards with varying routes and patrol patterns, stationary guards, floodlights, and then environmental factors like the snow which you leave footprints in. There's also multiple useful items, most notably a SOCOM pistol. Exploring and moving through the shadows can be tons of fun, and figuring out how new tools like chaff and stun grenades work is rewarding. However, having an area this dense, this early on, feels like the game's overstepping a little. There's no single area in the entire rest of the game with quite so much going on. Some places will have a few of these elements amongst them, but never all at once. It feels like everything's being thrown at you simultaneously as a gauntlet to force you to acclimatize yourself. It's effective, but can also mean failing multiple times before getting through clean, which doesn't feel good as a player, obviously. This area is overzealous and misplaced, making for a steep learning curve that overcompensates too early on. These different mechanics should be sprinkled in across a series of areas rather than just one. With that being said, I get it to some extent. It's very impressive just as a piece of level design for one, but there is also some acclimatization needed. The controls are kinda unique, and because the game's stealth systems are very naturalistic, you need to just test and experiment what the guards can and can't do. For example, a guard's awareness of the noise you're making isn't communicated by a little visibility meter showing up on screen, it's instead voiced aloud by the NPC before they move to check out the place where the noise was made. These touches make the game way more immersive and in some sense realistic, but they're also harder to quantify. So taking that into consideration, I can understand why an ambitious area would be chucked right at the beginning. The complexity here basically forces the player to at least learn a few important lessons regarding stealth gameplay. The less rigid environmental geometry will also teach you the value of the radar, letting you fully appreciate the extra context it provides and how that works in with the shifting fixed camera. The attention to detail extends beyond the game's systems and into visual touches as well. I really love how this game looks. To me, it's the quintessential example of the PS1 aesthetic. Pixelated 32-bit textures are wrapped around simple models and it looks fantastic. Everything feels consistent yet distinct. Those lower res textures also work to MGS's advantage as it gives palpable grit to the materials and world at large, feeling tonally in sync with the narrative side of the experience. Then there's heaps of small graphical touches that bolster the larger stylistic choices. There's the visible breaths from people in exterior environments, the presence of footprints in snow, and singular one-off things, like Snake's swimming suit collecting water around it on the ground once he's taken it off in the elevator. Everything feels so well thought out and considered. Metal Gear Solid is a very linear game, at many points just a series of interconnected corridors, but you're never left thinking that there's not actually anything beyond Shadow Moses' walls. It feels fully realized and believable. This extends to character interaction as well. Using the codec, you can call the support crew. There's Campbell and Naomi for info pertaining to your current objective, Nastasha for info on weapons and equipment, and Mei Ling who helps you save. She will then recite a Chinese proverb and relate it to whatever's happening in the story or your own performance in the game. There are fully scripted and voiced relationships between Snake and all these people, and they can be uncovered or fleshed out completely organically, happening only when you want it to, main story content aside. Like the gamified stealth, it feels naturalistic and innate, especially as much of it is contextual to your current situation. And while the quality of writing in these codec convos can vary, the voice acting is all really great, with pretty decent emotional range and a level of nuance that accurately reflects the writing and content. Of course, I can't mention voice acting without highlighting David Hayter's performance as Solid Snake. It is a very typical gravelly action hero approach, but leaves room for a level of snark and wittiness that's really infectious.
Take it easy, I'm grateful. If it weren't for your suit and your shot, I would have turned into a popsicle out there.
Each time Snake finds some humor in something, it's exciting and refreshing. It's a very charming interpretation that's become iconic for good reason. There's also a level of absurdity to just how gnarled the voice is. It highlights how ridiculous some of these lines can sound, which is super entertaining. But that's enough for now. What I've touched on with Snake's voice here will become more important as we explore his personality and role with greater depth. Once inside the facility, the mood becomes more muted. The only semblance of music could also be construed as pained groans of the massive metal and slate structure around you, the guards' crisp footsteps cutting through the noise, centering your focus on them, because even though you've gotten used to gameplay a bit so far, this room is more reflective of the rest of the experience. Once you leave the vents, the music becomes more pronounced and structured as you step into action. This area is cleverly split up. The bottom floor has 2 guards circling around, stopping occasionally, while the second floor has primarily cameras and just 1 guard. Importantly, it houses a few items to pick up, which along the way will teach you that guards on different elevations show up as only a dot on the radar, lacking a vision cone. This encourages you to observe in first person before ascending or descending, so you can ascertain the guard's direction and movement. This becomes a part of the player's stealth routine that the game attempts to instill in you. Through the introductory sequences and as you progress, the game introduces new factors and dynamics to consider when sneaking. These then become a part of a mental checklist you apply before proceeding, whether it's something basic like using the aforementioned first-person view, or cycling through useful tools like mine detectors. This creates sequences of satisfying espionage where you feel rewarded for engaging with the systems put forth. Level design generally does a good job of utilizing these different elements well, implementing them in different combinations amongst new geometry and terrain to keep things feeling fresh and challenging. Additionally, this discipline helps you relate to Snake more and feel better in his shoes, which is an important setup for his role in the plot. Something notable about this first Shadow Moses interior is the presence of tanks. This is the case in Outer Heaven from Metal Gear 1 and Zanzibar Land from Metal Gear 2. Each one confronts you with tanks immediately upon entering the respective facility proper. In each instance, it demonstrates the differential in firepower, encouraging you to keep quiet and out of sight. If you take the top path or explore and find your way into the highest fence of the room, you overhear a guard conversation about the DARPA chief being moved into a first floor basement cell, so that becomes your destination. Using the elevator, you make it to B1, then crawl through the vents to get to him, along the way spotting a woman who's also been locked up. Dropping down into his cell, Snake has a chat with Donald Anderson. He reveals that the terrorists do have the capability to fire a nuke, by way of a nuclear-equipped bipedal tank.
Metal Gear. It can't be.
As Anderson gives an overview of the project, Metal Gear Rex is shot largely from below in long takes. It casts an imposing shadow that looms over the player, wordlessly demonstrating the threat it poses. The DARPA chief explains that 2 different passwords have to be input to activate Rex, with the chief having one and President Baker of Arms Tech having the other. However, Anderson has given his password to the terrorists, thanks to Psycho Mantis's telepathic torture. Additionally, there are 3 card keys that can be inserted to engage Rex's safety lock, preventing a potential nuclear launch. Thankfully, Baker should have them, so your next goal becomes to retrieve them on the second floor basement. With that, the chief hands over his level 1 ID card so you can open more of the facility's doors. As Snake readies to leave, Anderson begins convulsing, suddenly dying from a heart attack. Snake grills the colonel on what just happened, though Campbell deflects that Baker is the priority right now. This conversation is sudden, overwhelming and garrulous, losing focus as it details how the ID cards react to the salt in Snake's body to transmit data and shit like that, but it's ultimately integral to the Metal Gear Solid experience. I just mentioned how the stealth process helps you relate to Snake, which is important as you need that investment to truly appreciate his journey and perspective. This cutscene builds on that, because while Snake isn't an audience surrogate, he has his own character, arc and personality, he is much like the player in one fundamental aspect, his ignorance. As we've just seen for the first of many times, Snake and by extension the player don't fully know what's going on here. He's blindsided by the existence of Metal Gear despite being the one person on Earth who's destroyed them, and he's done so twice. Snake's ignorance will be used as the channel through which thematic explorations of control and manipulation will happen. It's also the central anchor for his arc, and so we need to relate to him so that we can feel the impact and emotional weight of what he goes through, because as the player we also go through it to some extent. It's a good way to communicate politically minded ideas and topics, grounding them via character and emotion. This then brings us to the central theme of Metal Gear Solid, that being genes. We've seen this idea crop up repeatedly already through the comparison between Liquid and Solid, with them sharing code names, kinda like genetic code. The subjects discussed heaps in the briefing sessions via Naomi, and the terrorists ultimately want Big Boss's genes. It even exists in this cutscene. Discussion of genes naturally rolls into discussions of nature versus nurture, what is passed on and what is learned. This dichotomy could also be reworded as the transmission of information and the control of information. We've seen already how information has been controlled to get Snake on this job, and how the entire plot hinges around people wanting control as well. Then on the other side, Anderson's just explained that the only way to activate or deactivate Rex is by sharing information, whether through passwords or by the presence of 3 different keycards cross-verifying their data. This cutscene helps get the thematic content truly into gear, showing its hand somewhat, eventually capping it off with a dramatic death to add some propulsive tension, reflecting the conflict Snake faces. He needs to know more, but he doesn't have time to. He's in it now and has to do what he can to get to Baker. Snake leaves the cell and is held up by a guard, though she doesn't seem to have the nerve to pull the trigger. Snake sees right through her, spotting that she's not one of the terrorists. The pair are ambushed by a group of real guards, but they're able to take them all out. She takes off and we see a flashback of Liquid, Ocelot and Mantis having killed who appears to be Anderson. Back in the present, Mantis takes over the rookie's mind, forcing her to shoot at Snake as the elevator closes and takes her away. Heading down to B2, you use your new keycard to pick up some C4 from the armory. Cleverly, there are no guards in this room for this initial visit, letting you get used to its layout as it will serve as a central location for the critical path. Using the C4, Snake blows his way to President Baker, who he finds tied up and surrounded by explosives and tripwires. Revolver Ocelot reveals himself.
Revolver Ocelot.
He draws his weapon and fires, starting the boss battle. It's overall kinda clunky because you have to rely on auto-aim hitting a target that often isn't even on screen, but trying to catch him while he's reloading to get free shots off is satisfying nonetheless. It's pretty good. Ocelot readies to finish Snake off before his hand is severed by an invisible ninja, who then cuts Baker free as well. Ocelot escapes and the cyborg ninja goes nuts before leaving himself. Baker then tells us that he gave his password away thanks to Ocelot's torture. He also gave his keycards to the woman we met earlier, who seems to be Meryl, Campbell's niece, though he doesn't remember her Kodak number. Baker recommends trying to find Hal Emmerich too, who designed Metal Gear, before detailing why it was developed, as a last effort by Arms Tech to secure military contracts from the government, funded by the CIA and taking advantage of the now out-of-work former Soviet nuclear scientists in response to the continued proliferation of nuclear materials and weapons, some of which are circulated globally via a black market. He finishes by handing Snake an optical disc of Metal Gear test data, a level 2 ID card, and some details on the ninja, saying he's an experiment of Foxhound, though he suggests you ask Naomi for details. Baker's words become strained and weak as he convulses and dies of a heart attack, just like the DARPA chief. Okay, that was a lot of exposition-y stuff, but like the convo with the DARPA chief, it too unravels some integral info. Primarily, it's using Baker's position as a way to begin incorporating more explicitly anti-war content. His comments on the governmental lies around nuclear deproliferation and focus on off-the-books funding of Metal Gear is clearly positioning everything around Metal Gear as wrong. This ties into the inherent anti-war base of Metal Gear as a series. This is true from Metal Gear 1 right up to Metal Gear Solid 5. The focus on stealth-based, non-violent combat is subverting the typical military-focused game, and so just the act of sneaking by guards with guns instead of mowing them all down with their own guns reinforces the anti-war threads that come in narratively. This cutscene is making that cross-pollination more explicit. As it gets into finer detail, it reincorporates the subject of control, which branches off the idea of genes. The Metal Gear project, as stated, is funded by off-the-book CIA money, and this context allows for a skewering of the military-industrial complex writ large to be implied. In this example, the public sector is funding accumulation of private capital by way of weapons manufacturing for the purpose of a nebulous future war that, based off America's history, will exist mainly for the expansion of their own empire via the presence of American capital in foreign soil, a war that will be rejected by anyone with a brain and accepted only thanks to the American propaganda machine and a misplaced sense of patriotism. Every step of the way, citizens, working people, are being controlled, manipulated, and lorded over so that this process can play out. Even more so for those who will be in America's crosshairs because they decided to be born outside the imperial core like dummies. Maybe it seems like I'm extrapolating and interpreting with too much creative license, but I think there's precedent for what I've touched on across the series. In Metal Gear 2, the existence of oilics implicated the value of natural resources to war and imperialism. NATO bombs out of heaven at the end of Metal Gear 1, which creates the material conditions out of which Zanzibar land is born, with a charismatic leader like Big Boss manipulating the people who are most affected to his own ends, ones that seek to perpetuate war forever. The most indicting aspect of this, that I think backs up my idea of what the game's identifying and criticizing here, is when and how this speech happens. In my Metal Gear 1 and 2 video, I pointed out how the script often elongates and gives people room to talk once they're finally ready to spill the truth. Characters won't have much to say until it all comes out at once, even more so for villains on their deathbeds. This style of scripting then creates a dichotomy of speech and divulgence equaling truth, or good, and terseness as equaling deception and guilt, or bad. And as we've just seen, Baker just blurts everything out here, even that which indicts him as a capitalist pig fueling forever wars with his weapons because it's good for business. Which brings me around to my last point in this cutscene. Baker does something very interesting. When trying and failing to remember Meryl's codec number, he instead instructs you to look at the back of the CD case to find it. Kojima's not one to shy away from breaking the fourth wall, but this particular instance has more intent behind it. It's more explicitly introducing the idea of the player being under control as well. The common conception is that we interact with the game, we have control over the main character and by extension the experience itself. But Baker's request here fights against that. Meryl's codec number really is on the back of the CD case, and so the game's forcing you to put the controller down in order to progress. It's exercising control over how you interact. Games tend to avoid breaking immersion in order to keep you bought in, to make sure you always feel in control. Metal Gear Solid does the opposite to highlight the artificiality of our control, and how the reality is in rather stark contrast. The game dictates what the player does or can do, not so much the other way round. Obviously there's nuance to this and it's a case-by-case basis, but it's an especially well-made point in a rather linear game like Metal Gear Solid, a point which externalizes the narrative themes to permeate outside the console and controller into physical space through subversive, inventive fourth wall breaks. Having a chat to Meryl, Snake learns that Hal Emmerich should know how to defeat Metal Gear should the override fail, and that is in a building to the north. Snake's able to head north thanks to Meryl unlocking the cargo door and his trusty cigarettes, though he's interrupted by Vulcan Raven in a tank who really loves to hammer home the whole "we're dogs of war" thing by bringing up everyone's animal-related codenames, emphasizing the dehumanizing aspects of war driven by base instinct. After a few grenades, the tank explodes and Snake grabs another keycard, though the terrorists seem to just be toying with him for now. Now in the North building, Snake's restricted from using his weapons due to the active warheads in the room, demonstrating the strict system of control he's under and the total lack of effort as it pertains to nuclear deproliferation. There's finally a decent chunk of typical gameplay, which is refreshing. The story stuff is generally engaging enough to not feel like a burden that interrupts gameplay, but the game's hit and miss about letting gameplay feel smooth when you're interacting with it. There's clear thought into how the third dimension can be used to smarten gameplay up in small ways. For example, elevators are viewed in first person, letting you select a floor, but also see out the door once it opens, so you can make sure you're at the right place before you leave. But then later on, when you have to direct a Nikita missile to an electrical panel to deactivate an electrocuted floor, it completely belabors the point with a slow cutscene and then a codec call on top of that to really beat it over your head. The game can just get a little overbearing, which really slows the pace down. No doubt this is due in part to the novelty of 3D, but it's an aspect which hasn't aged well. After taking care of the floor and exploring to pick up some items, Snake moves on. He enters into a hallway full of dead bodies, the cruelty and unsettling nature of the violence highlighted by the Dutch angles taken up by the camera. This odd, warbly kind of rambling scores your walk as flutes reminiscent of those in samurai movies work their way in.
It's a ghost.
As we see the ninja from earlier shake a victim off their sword and enter the next room. Following in their footsteps, we see them approach Hal Emmerich. They turn around and see Snake, recognizing him. They speak rather cryptically, ultimately wanting to simply fight. This boss fight, much like a similar one from Metal Gear 2, is incredibly clunky. The game just isn't made for hand-to-hand combat, and the ninja's acrobatics in combination with a top-down view make it tough to tell when you're going to actually get hit. Eventually you do start to understand the patterns, it might just take a death or two. After taking a couple hits, the cyborg puts away the sword. In the second half, things get pretty manic, given the evident pleasure the ninja derives from the violence, beginning to ask Snake if he remembers the feel of battle as the fight nears its end. Once defeated, the ninja begins to lose touch, bashing their skull against the ground in their despair, then turning invisible and taking off. The ninja turns out to be Grey Fox, a Foxhound member who Snake rescued in Metal Gear 1 and then later fought to the death in Metal Gear 2. Grey Fox was revived and used as a gene therapy experiment by Foxhound for 4 years. That being said, Naomi claims he died in an explosion later on, calling into question whether the cyborg is really him. In Metal Gear 2, we see Grey Fox become dehumanized, manipulated by Big Boss to become a tool of war, emphasized by his piloting of Metal Gear. The only time he's truly presented as human is in the end, when he fights Snake hand to hand, so this re-encounter is highlighting how he's continued to be used, his human body completely obfuscated by robotics and technology of war. Even when he no longer knows himself, the only way he can reconnect to humanity is by fighting Snake again, hence his presence here. In Metal Gear 2, he was a symbol for that game's themes, and that trend continues, someone controlled for the sake of conflict, doomed by DNA to a tragic existence. The conversation Snake has with Campbell and Naomi has a deep sadness to it. There's venom and insistence in Naomi's quiet voice, the only music being angelic vocal samples, lamenting the life Grey Fox never got to live. This encounter is naturally very important to Snake. It's not only dredging up memories of the past, but relating it to his own experience, as he continues to be used and lied to for the benefit of a government agency. Grey Fox is a cautionary tale, a reflexive symbol of his potential future. This is made all the more apparent via gameplay, as this fight in Metal Gear Solid is very similar to its counterpart in Metal Gear 2, creating a neat comparison point, but at the same time also a deeper investment into the idea of player control. Here we're being made to, in some sense, replay the old game, as though this one is a derivative of it, thanks to the DNA they share mechanically and story-wise. Many of Metal Gear 2's ideas have been passed down, yet it's expressed differently, as seen by not only the evolution of 3D, but smaller things like setting, new characters, and so on. The tanks at the entrance of the facility, using a remote missile to take out an electrified floor, saving a hostage in the beginning, codec messages from a mysterious person throughout the game, and tons we've yet to see. They all come from Metal Gear 2, but we've been made to do them again, tricked by a different context to replay them. With the ideas of genes, DNA and control being pulled well and truly to the forefront, Snake formally meets Emmerich. He designed Metal Gear but was unaware it would be equipped to fire a nuclear weapon. He begins to have a bit of a breakdown, realizing he's been used to create a WMD. He tells Snake that his grandfather was part of the Manhattan Project, and his father was born on the day Hiroshima was nuked. 3 men tied to the history of nuclear weapons, with Hal being kept in the dark to ensure his involvement. However, he's able to tell us where Metal Gear is being kept. He's been given an opportunity to redeem himself and defy the fate his DNA seems determined to deal him. Here, Metal Gear Solid is actively decrying the determinism of DNA, endorsing choice and the ability to decide who you are. This is heightened by Snake's concern that Hal will suddenly keel over from a heart attack, though he doesn't, belying not just his DNA but the structure of the script as well. Snake wants Meryl to look after Otacon, but she's unable to make contact without giving herself away, so he's got to seek her out within the building, going to do just that. Before we can cover that though, I should acknowledge the iconic moments that happen here, like this.
It's like one of my Japanese animes.
Or the pants pissing, or the fact that the name Otacon comes from otaku convention. As serious and consequential as the game's themes can be, there is a light-hearted humorous streak that stops it from becoming too bleak, playing into the game's absurdity so that things can still feel fun and exciting in an optimistic way. Back up on B1, there are a number of guards wandering around a central room. One of these is Meryl, and the way you're meant to spot her is by looking at how she walks, specifically how her hips sway, which is why the game has a shot dedicated to just that earlier. Okay, let's get into this. The way women are written and perceived in Metal Gear Solid is directly tied to our relationship to Snake. Earlier I mentioned how we aren't meant to think we're Snake, but are meant to relate to him. This allows the thematic content to work on multiple levels at once and gets us invested in the plot, while at the same time letting Snake be one of those typical action heroes he's modelled off. His cynical, no-nonsense approach, short, pointed remarks and gruff voice are signalling how cool he is. He's at once a victim to larger forces so we can relate to him, and a renegade who plays by his own rules but ultimately does the right thing. This adherence to dated movie tropes means that practically every woman Snake talks to makes a pass at him or gets flustered when he does the same, even when it makes no sense given their relationship, like with Naomi for example. They even make the only female villain someone who becomes infatuated with her targets, so she loves Snake as well, even if in a twisted sort of way. The sexuality of most of these women doesn't feel like something they own, but rather something that exists for Snake and by extension an assumed straight male player. Additionally, they're portrayed as very emotional, but notably not in a way that they can parlay into a position of power like the game's villains, but instead in a way that requires a man to rescue or take care of them. This lack of control they're afforded then ties into what the female characters actually do in the game, which is to say, not much. Meryl, the most consequential woman in the cast, doesn't contribute all that much but rather act as a goal for Snake to attain. Materially speaking, she contributes less than even Otacon, someone who's literally introduced to the player as a pants-pissing coward. Some of these things could be seen as a level of commentary. Maybe the women aren't in as much power due to the differing limits on upward mobility that are put on men and women, but I think that's giving the writers too much credit, especially if we keep in mind our relationship to Snake. He's not perfect, and we're not supposed to think he is, but we are supposed to think he's cool, and the shortcomings of his that are made more prominent aren't related to misogyny. He's clearly closed off, but it doesn't read as a gendered type of toxic stoicism. It applies to everyone and the world at large. What this means is that the sexual remarks, the underestimating of his female affiliates, and the objectification are coming from the part of Snake we're meant to think is cool and smooth and tough. He perpetuates a casually misogynistic machismo, and although that is interestingly played on in the next game, here it only reinforces the sense that the text just doesn't see the women in it as equal to the men. I don't think Metal Gear Solid is an actively misogynistic game, but it is one that feels written by men with no grasp of misogyny and how it manifests and is reinforced. Its approach to gender is traditional and shallow in a way that pushes women to the peripheral out of its own ignorance, and it's something Kojima's games struggle with to this day. In fact, once you make contact with Meryl, you transition into a section where she's literally used as a plot device to advance Snake's characterization. She does get some development, discarding the disguise to face reality while also handing over the card keys from Baker. Or, more accurately, key singular, as there's only one, so the other two will have to be found. At the end, Meryl brings it back to Jeans, hoping that becoming a soldier would bring her closer to her dead father, proving to be a faulty decision. Leaving the bathroom, Snake acknowledges the lack of music.
What happened to the music?
Easing us into the mindfuck to come. Heading north to the commander's room, Meryl begins to unravel. Psycho Mantis has his hooks in her again. She's puppeted to become infatuated with Snake, her gun raised. It's pretty intense, having to knock Meryl out in order to snap her out of it, a tame prelude for what's to come. Mantis looks back upon your performance, commenting based on the actions you've taken so far. Even though much of the game is about control, this fight is specifically about something I brought up earlier, the loss of control. Psycho Mantis is highlighting that we as players can't do anything the game hasn't accounted for. Our control is limited and largely illusory. Thanks to how Snake is made relatable to the player, this shattering of the fourth wall is no doubt jarring, but easy to accept. It's of course completely groundbreaking as well. Games just hadn't done this type of thing. It creates a surreal, cerebral, and fascinating adventure that's impossible to forget. It's exciting and energizing to be a part of. It's not a one-trick pony though, with Mantis using his powers to move the controller via vibration, and him only becoming vulnerable once you switch the controller to the second port. Beyond the neat tricks, the idea of control is rife throughout the content of the fight. You battle in a commander's room, and Mantis throws austere, valuable objects at you, representations of wealth, which is what control and power is channeled through. Additionally, Mantis's design plays into the concept. He wears what is essentially BDSM gear, clothing meant to frame and in some cases bind the body, pulling from a culture that plays with dynamics of power and control. He also wears a gas mask, and that, along with his pallid skin, makes him alike to the marble busts that are placed around the room, Mantis appearing just as lifeless and inhuman as they are. There's also animal skulls up on the wall, tying into the idea of war-making beasts of men, carried through by the animal-based codenames so much of the cast have. Finally, there's a holographic projection of the tower building on a table, which ties everything up. Mantis isn't only reading our past to break the illusion of control, but showing us our future, as that's where we'll travel next. The fight itself isn't perfect despite the stellar setup and thematic implications. Mantis floats and teleports around, hurling objects at you in different patterns. This isn't inherently bad, but the room is just a little too small, and so they're often flying from off-screen, so reacting in time is really tough. Also, the gunplay in MGS is stilted and restricted, so having to engage with it for a protracted sequence like this can be frustrating. Fortunately, it's not enough to snap the tension. Taking the final bullet, Psycho Mantis is flung behind the commander's desk, Snake possibly, symbolically, clawing back some control. As Mantis gasps for breath, he tells Snake how to proceed. In true Metal Gear fashion, redemption is extended to a villain as Mantis begins to explain why he is the way he is. This is a classic Kojima trope and plays off the dichotomy around speech and good and bad that I established earlier. The paternal dynamic is brought up as Mantis' first foray into mind reading forced him to discover that his father blamed him for his mother's death in childbirth. He resents his DNA and the need people have to pass it on. His resentment ferments, eventually joining Liquid only because he wanted an opportunity to kill as many people as possible. The similarities he sees between him and Snake on the surface read like projection, but are keying into what the fight against him highlighted. The player, through their love of video games, has an urge to kill as well. While these monologues may be long-winded and to some pace breakers, they are thoughtful in how they humanize people, give them space to explain themselves, and in almost all cases give insight into the circumstances that inform who they are today. It's a level of maturity few games had at the time, knowing when to cut out the puerile absurdity and trade it in for something more thought-provoking, or do away with it altogether to center sincerity instead. There's an undeniable care the game has for each of its characters that shines through, which is what makes it way less dogmatic and fanatical than other military games of the time and today.
It feels kind of nice.
Snake and Meryl move onwards to the underground base. Some landmines have been laid down ahead, and Meryl bravely cuts a path between them to help you progress. Oh. Or you can just walk forward. Meryl's rewarded for her bravery with a few shots to the abdomen courtesy of Sniper Wolf. Snake rushes off to grab a sniper rifle so he can fight back and save Meryl. People complain about a couple instances of backtracking in this game, this being one of them, but I really don't think it's that bad. Both Building 1 and 2 were designed to have a clear central room that houses a number of items locked behind different doors, and so when you do have to backtrack, it's pretty clear where you have to go. Like in Metal Gear 1 and 2, entering from a new direction gives each room a different stealth context, so that gameplay still feels a little different as well. Getting back to where Meryl was shot, Snake finds that she's no longer there and faces off against Wolf one-on-one. With no effective system for cover and just a corridor to shoot down, this fight can prove to be pretty frustrating. The only real way to avoid getting hit is to shoot first, which is tough when the reticle is so slow to move when zoomed in. Regardless, Snake is able to come out on top. Moving to exit the building, he's ambushed and knocked out. He awakens underneath oppressive fluorescent lighting as Liquid monologues, seeing Solid as the brother of light and himself as the brother of dark. He takes off to oversee the nuke launch, set to happen in 10 hours. Ocelot asks us how to use Baker's key, but Snake has no answers. So begins the torture. It's another great mechanical subversion, with Ocelot referencing how failing this changes the game's ending, which it does. The act itself involves mashing circle as Snake's shocked, the length increasing with each round, in turn, theoretically building up pain in your hand/arm as you fight to keep the gauge full. It's not too difficult to do so, but it's novel nonetheless. After the first bout of torture, Snake's taken to a cell and grills Campbell about the information he's been hiding. This conversation is incredibly rich and identifies a big point of contention that the game uses as part of its anti-war sentiment. The terrorist demands can't be placated in any way, as revealing the existence of nuclear weapon development and an army based on genetic experiments would jeopardize the US's position as a global superpower. The lives of millions of civilians and Snake's own is being put at risk in the name of nationalism, of the upholding of an empire built on the expansion of capital's forces. This is another moment of reconciliation for the game's themes, crystallizing into an important point, one that weaves in with Snake's own characterization. Snake is someone who wants to do the right thing, but is hamstrung by the parasitic, exploitative systems around him. At the same time, there are people within those systems and aspects of it that he needs to succeed, like Mei Ling or Campbell, and so he's ultimately at its whim. The frustration and reluctance he exhibits is cathartic and relatable in a very real way for many people. Even if the stakes for your average person are not so grand, trying to do the right thing, live honestly, is tough as a working person in the Imperial Core. This relation between player and protagonist lets the game identify and criticize a deep-seated contradiction in the United States' history. It brings to mind the polarity of historical idealism and historical materialism. Idealism being the belief that history is pushed forward by ideas, and materialism being the idea that history is pushed forward by the material circumstances of people. You can already see a tie between this and genes. Are you defined by a thing above you, larger than you, like your lineage or ideas, or are you defined by your conditions and lived experience? These two concepts are particularly important here as they lead to what Campbell's saying. The American Revolution is purported to have been fought over the idea of freedom, of self-determination and individual liberty. This is the root at which the country's mostly self-proclaimed reputation as a bastion of freedom, democracy and truth comes from. This is the idealist perspective. However, the American Revolution was really fought over the freedom of a select group of people. The burgeoning merchant class in America at the time didn't like that they were paying taxes to the British Empire, and so a revolt began, leading to a newly independent nation. This is the materialist perspective, one built on the circumstances and historical reality at the time. This aforementioned contradiction is how you get a constitution proclaiming the equality of all, written by slave owners, because America wasn't founded on the freedom of all people, but the freedom of profit. This fundamental misunderstanding of history, one that fails to look at things from the materialist point of view, builds a nation that at its core must lie and deceive and control in order to uphold its own narrative of a historical tradition forged on ideas. So, when Campbell explains that people must be kept ignorant so that the United States may uphold its reputation, he's drawing on this contradiction. Snake in response is baffled. What the Colonel's saying fundamentally doesn't make sense, yet he's powerless to fight against it because in order to try and survive he needs the system spouting this nonsense in the first place, looping back around to how the player relates to Snake. As this sensation is likely something they've identified themselves, however subconscious that identification may be. We're seeing the game do this, have its themes permeate yet simmer away before boiling over as they converge into a larger point which implicates them all. It creates a satisfying narrative rhythm for a story so hinged on mystery, as you do feel like you're getting substantial answers along the way, despite core, compelling questions still remaining. Things calm down a little as Snake endures a second bout of torture before getting Otacon to help with his stealth camouflage. Snake uses some ketchup to feign a pool of blood, tempting the guard inside and taking him out. He picks up his gear and exits the building towards the comms tower. As he makes his way north, you can stock up on ammo in the various central rooms while picking up new items like body armor which cuts damage in half when equipped. Finally back where he fought Wolf, Snake advances onto the communication tower, beginning what's probably the weakest part of the game. Similar to Metal Gear 1, this is a point where you can kind of fuck yourself if you happen to play the wrong way earlier. This first tower is rife with group after group of guards who are quite hard to hit given the difference in elevation, so the best strategy is to use stun grenades repeatedly. But if you don't have enough, then it's practically impossible to get to the top and progress. It's a baffling choice. You could, I suppose, go back and explore for stun ammo to pick up, but this spamming of guards only serves to call back to Metal Gear 2, which while playing into that aspect of player control, doesn't justify this design choice. Exiting onto the roof so you can get to the second tower building, Snake's confronted by Liquid in a Hind helicopter. He blows up the walkway and so you have to rappel down. It's a shallow and contrived set piece that's not worth dwelling on, so I won't. Once inside Comms Tower B, Snake meets up with Otacon who arrived via elevator. This is the iconic moment where Snake laments not saving Meryl, causing Otacon to ask,
Do you think love can bloom, even on a battlefield?
It's so ham-fisted and jarring and feels like Snake is talking literally right to the camera, which makes it dumb in a way that I love. It does also tie into where each of them are as people, but the sense of dread and failure these two men have around love is just communicated in the most dramatic way possible. It's a brief respite before you must ascend again, in a fashion just as bad as earlier, this time dealing with turrets instead of guards. You step outside to do away with Liquid and the Hind. In Metal Gear 1, I criticised how the game leaned too much into action set pieces without a suite of mechanics to back them up, and after the rope section you'd think this boss would repeat that problem, but it actually manages to work. The simple act of having to duck behind cover and make liberal use of your radar to track Liquid's positioning inserts enough elements of stealth to feel in keeping with the gameplay experience. It's exhilarating with moments of tense quiet that make for a fun fight. With one last missile, the helicopter plummets to the ground, taking out Liquid. Although Liquid's out of the picture, the nuclear threat still stands, so Snake heads onwards to the underground base where Rex lies. Now back out in the snow, Snake's ambushed by Sniper Wolf, though Otacon begs him not to kill her. This iteration of the Wolf fight is way improved from the previous version. It's still not ideal, seeing as the game has no true cover or camouflage system, but with more of an actual landscape to post up in, it becomes more dynamic and interesting. Much like Mantis, Wolf details her backstory after being defeated. Due to where she grew up, amongst war, Wolf felt ignored and betrayed by the world and its states, not too unlike Big Boss. He soon appeared in her life, recruiting her as a sniper. Snake reassures her, gives a speech reminiscent of Big Boss, sympathizing with Wolf. With the comparisons between Liquid and Solid and now Solid and Big Boss, this speech showcases the dualistic reaction of children. Firstly, we see Liquid following directly in Boss's footsteps, but then where Big Boss would pluck these people out of tragic circumstances so he could mold them and have them serve his purpose, Snake instead talks them down almost, shows them that they can be given another chance that doesn't hinge on endless combat. Sure, Snake is in a sense doing what Big Boss predicted in Metal Gear 2, coming back to war despite supposedly leaving it behind, but he's defying Boss at the same time as he does so. The character work then becomes more immediate as Otacon mourns Wolf's death, having loved her. She begs to be set free, the dramatic location and camera work creating a keenly affecting moment informed by how she's been changed by Big Boss and Snake.
Goodbye.
With her passed on, Snake continues forth to the underground base. You move through the blast furnace and then down some cargo elevators. While doing so, Master Miller calls to divulge something he learned about Naomi. I haven't really mentioned him much because he's not very consequential until now, just advising you on different survival tactics, so it feels very jarring that he suddenly injects himself. Regardless, he seems wary of some of what Naomi said about her family, questioning if she's a spy, again keeping insistent on the subject of deception and betrayal. Moving onwards to the cold storage room, Snake's confronted with Vulcan Raven, now equipped with a chain gun. In a really interesting move, the game actually engages with his Native American and Inuit background as it pertains to the game's psychological and by extension spiritual moments. He mentions Snake's Eastern blood, a reference to him being designed in Japan as a video game character. Then a comparison is made to the earpull event in Inuit Olympics, the forthcoming fight determining spiritual and physical strength. These two ideas, spirituality and strength, then become embodied by each participant, as Raven's approach is violent and excessive, unloading hundreds of bullets down hallways. In contrast, Snake instead uses guided missiles strategically maneuvered to take Raven by surprise. It's a fun, engaging fight that's made more so by how Raven will shoot down certain crates to block access and dynamically shift level geometry. However, the second half unfortunately proves long in the tooth, with Raven running all over the place and barely stopping, which makes connecting shots quite tough. On his deathbed, Raven proves way more self-assured and confident of his fate, a stark contrast to Mantis and Wolf, possibly due to his sustained connection to his community and people. He hands Snake the final keycard, level 8, before being consumed by his ravens. Miller calls afterwards to inform him of what he found out about Naomi, sowing more doubt as to who she's working with. You finally enter the bunker, Metal Gear Rex menacingly looming over you. The normally angelic vocal samples found in the soundtrack are swapped for something more somber and guttural. Rex is appropriately framed as monstrous and perverse. At the same time, arpeggioed notes reminiscent of the sound effects that play after using a chaff grenade shimmer amongst the mix, making sure to reinforce that while Rex is built out of a base, instinctual need for power, it's very much a product of the modern age. It occupies 3 levels and takes you through 2 loading zones just to scale it. The game's using its own metrics for size as a piece of software to communicate Metal Gear's power. As you climb it, Otacon begins hacking into President Baker's files in an attempt to figure out the secret using the PAL keys, along the way finding something else out. Due to being fired from a railgun and not using fuel, the projectile isn't considered a missile, bypassing loopholes in a number of international treaties. This unmatched power reinforces what I put forward earlier, of the US Empire's inherent contradiction that allows them to invade, steal and exploit with practical impunity. Neoliberalism has given us a globe connected only as a conduit for the accumulation of capital. The theoretical international agreements to effect positive political change around the world that neoliberals love so much are a farce. We've seen just a couple months ago the US completely veto a UN agreement to a ceasefire in occupied Palestine, even though 13 other nations agreed to it. Rex personifies this power, a truly repulsive symbol of American hegemony. Now, although historically Kojima isn't quite as critical and not always from the same practically Marxist angle I've been in this video of America, Nostalgia does basically co-sign what I just said, specifically mentioning America's inability to give up its position as de facto world leader. Snake nears the command room and eavesdrops on Ocelot's and Liquid's conversation. They plan to fire the nuke, changing the target to China. Their demands also now include the Foxdie vaccine, the virus which killed Decoy Octopus as the DARPA chief and President Baker, with the rest of the terrorists believed to be infected as well. Liquid plans to post up in the base until their demands are met, possibly joining forces with Spetsnaz officer Sergei Golukovich, reviving Big Boss's dream of an independent military group that perpetuates war. Otacon calls to tell you how the PAL keys work, revealing that the override system functions by inserting the same key at 3 separate temperatures, room temperature, hot and cold, with it changing shape each time, like Natasha's brooch from Metal Gear 2. Snake spotted during his talk with Otacon, Ocelot firing at him and causing him to drop the PAL key on the first floor of the room. What follows is succeeding the sniper, the second most prominent case of backtracking. It's not too bad, it's pretty obvious where you have to change the card's temperature considering how much the foundry and cold storage rooms stick out, but I do get people's frustration with it. The level design for this portion of the game gets downright nonsensical. There's a room with literally like 30 turrets in it and another with claymores on the floor, while your radar is jammed so there's no way to actually detect them. Considering what I've said about player control, maybe this absurdist design is meant to prod you and make light of what you're forced to go through, but it doesn't honestly read that way. It's just reminiscent of bad design, there's no true subversion to it. As you deal with the keys, Miller calls once more, explaining Foxdie and implying that Naomi was behind it. Campbell tells us Naomi was working with the terrorists. Naomi herself then calls. She was responsible for Foxdie but explains her reasoning. Frank Yeager, Grey Fox, is her adoptive brother, and both were saved by Big Boss. Snake went on to kill Big Boss and Grey Fox at Zanzibar Land. Naomi then swore to take Snake out, joining Foxhound and waiting 2 years until this mission came around. Foxdie targets people based on their genes and is set up as a symbol for the game's central theme. With Snake infected, his survival hangs up in the air. Whether he succumbs to Foxdie or not will seal the game's perspective, although it has already been pretty thoroughly telegraphed by now. Regardless, it's a compelling setup to add extra tension to this final act, bolstered by emotional weight from the series' history. To ladle on more betrayal, she tells us that Foxdie was a mandated part of the assignment, but is cut off before she can finish, officially removed from the operation. Snake inserts the final PAL key, which activates Rex instead of deactivating it. Miller then calls, revealing himself to actually be Liquid. They hadn't been able to get the DARPA Chief's code, so manipulated and controlled Snake to figure out how the PAL keys worked, activating Rex for them. This plays into the idea of control and power as it forks out from genes and DNA, but also specifically implicates the player's control once more, as we were really doing what the villains wanted. You leave the command room and confront Liquid as he stands atop Rex. It's important to note that despite all the twists and turns of the plot, the threat of Metal Gear Rex is never undermined. It's always held up as a threat, so while the story's absurdity can take away from the stakes of some aspects, Rex never crumbles under that pressure. It's a reliable device for motivation the whole time, which makes the convoluted story more bearable. Liquid tells Snake that he was never meant to stop Rex. He was merely a vector for Foxdie to spread around Shadow Moses. It's sort of the final nail in the coffin, Snake hearing about how premeditated his country's betrayal of him was, delivered to him from a representation of his DNA and genes, who in turn controlled and manipulated him. It's just a nice bow on a stack of all Metal Gear Solid's themes, sitting neatly amongst one line. Liquid then goes into Les Enfants, the project to use Big Boss's genes to birth the perfect soldier, of which Liquid and Solid Snake were a part of. The setup for the game's final statement starts here as Liquid begins to get all pissy about Snake getting the dominant genes and him the recessive. Basically, Liquid's mad at Snake for killing Dad before he could. That's how much he hated him, which is a fucking gumbo of family drama. This then leads to my favourite line delivery in the game.
You're just like Naomi.
Well, I'm not like you!
It so perfectly shows Liquid for who he is, a pathetic man way too tied up in his own victimhood to see reality. He's bitter, resentful, and completely warped. It makes him tons of fun to watch and destroy. Liquid hops into Metal Gear as it roars to life. Rex fires missiles in volleys of 3s at Snake as you try and use Stinger missiles to take out its shield module. It can be pretty tough, and Metal Gear Rex is quite intimidating with its overwhelming size and dinosaur roars, which is a detail I love, by the way. Stealth really doesn't play too much of a role, unfortunately, and in fact getting close is the better option, as the machine gun and laser sweep are easier to dodge. Despite depleting the health bar, Rex is still kicking and advancing on Snake until Grey Fox jumps in to stop it. His inclusion here is incredibly important. Grey Fox piloting Metal Gear back in Metal Gear 2 represented how he had been dehumanized by war, and this continued with the experiments that made him into a cyborg. So for him to fight against Metal Gear now shows an innate humanity to all people, even those thought to be completely lost, how no matter what we still have some control. It's also especially poignant for Snake as Grey Fox reflects what Snake could be, what war does to people. He's also someone Snake's called a friend, one of the few people who we could relate to. Grey Fox showing up here to help out is the reinforcement Snake needs to persist after his reality's been torn to shreds 4 times over in the last 12 hours. Fox uses a final shot to debilitate Rex, going on to explain his relationship with Naomi. Fox was the one to make her an orphan in the first place, a twisted family built off guilt. Naomi's misled dedication to DNA was born out of the love she had for a family member who shared none of it. As Grey Fox distracts Metal Gear, his non-gun arm is cut off, finally turning him into purely a weapon. Snake has the shot on Rex lined up but can't fire as it would kill Fox as well. Fox begs to be free before finally being crushed as he urges Snake to fight for what he believes in. The second fight against Rex is much like the first, though the narrative weight presses down on your chest with more immediacy now. One last missile leaves Rex groaning for life as it explodes, Snake being knocked out in the process. You stare up at Liquid bathed in red, fiery light, left stationary and looking around like the torture sequence. Liquid pontificates on his ideology, later reading Snake and the player for filth, hating war yet participating in it, perpetuating it by mindlessly playing video games about it. We're being asked to consider our place as the conduit through which this plot and its intra-world conflict is able to play out. This is also an internal idea that the game, and by extensions its creators, are wrestling with as well. Metal Gear Solid is a firmly anti-war game, yet its dedication to realism and military detail shows a certain respect and love of it all. Both Kojima and the game hate war, but kind of think guns are cool. The connections between genetic code and software code come to a head here, at a moment when we're in first person, when the speaker can look us in our eyes. Laissez-faire of course ties into the discussion of DNA as it relates to the game world, but acknowledges the fact that it's just characters talking, creations, code. Can the players say they hate war if they engage with it in such simulated detail? Can the developers say the same if they're the one who programmed the simulation? And can Snake try and deny his love of war if he always finds himself drawn back into it? Let's find out. After having more of a wince to Snake, getting on his anti-choice shit explaining eugenics and then narrating some stock footage, Liquid claims himself a slave to his genes. He wants to save his genetic brethren, the genome soldiers that were created using Big Boss's cells, and will go to the lengths we've seen so far to do it. He's a complicated mix of family issues, lust for violence and power, and a deterministic outlook ironically shaped by the conditions under which he was born. Basically, he's a messy bitch. Meryl's revealed to be tied up, and now that the feds know Metal Gear's out of commission, they're going to bomb Shadow Moses to cover the whole thing up. It's similar to what NATO did at the end of Metal Gear 1, which created the circumstances for what happened in Metal Gear 2, which then leads directly to this game. There's not much time left, and Liquid needs to be dealt with once and for all, so Snake puts his fists up, ready to battle it out on top of the crumbling symbol of US domination and genetic fatalism. The actual fight is, like its equivalent in Metal Gear 2, quite clunky, in much the same way the Grey Fox fight was. Fortunately, devising a pattern isn't too tough, and the narrative importance of everything is so potent that it still gets your heart pumping, especially with the time limit. Snake eventually comes out on top, Liquid plunging into the depths of the underground base below. Snake then unties Meryl, and while I have been critical of the writing of her, she at least gives Snake a personal, emotional motivation, one that helps balance him out due to the barrage of betrayal he faces, so seeing them reunited is sweet on some level. Snake consults Otacon, who's able to identify a route out of the facility, finally taking ownership over his decisions, bravely staying behind to assist us. Meryl and Snake come across a parking garage and enter a turret-mounted truck to drive towards the exit. Liquid soon enters in his own car, giving chase, somehow surviving for like a third time. As they near the end, Liquid veers ahead, the two vehicles colliding and rolling out into the Alaskan snow. Liquid ambles towards Snake with his gun raised, when suddenly Foxdie strikes. The Colonel calls to say that the Secretary of Defense who helmed the mission, including Rex's development, was working alone and has been arrested, the airstrike called off in turn, though it's hard to believe what anyone on the other side of that codec could have to say at this point. Snake then passes on Grey Fox's message to Naomi, but keeps the secret about her parents to himself. Then, to pay off on Foxdie's setup, she says that Snake will only die when his time is up. Metal Gear Solid explicitly, definitively shows its hand. Snake's able to survive a virus engineered to attack his genes specifically. If he can defy a fate that seems as certain as that, then our DNA can't determine everything about us. We still have some agency, even when subjugated and led by the systems of control that surround us every day. Snake and Meryl descend towards a convenient, singular snowmobile, as Snake decides to live for life itself, rather than the moments in which he's closest to death. The two drive off into the sunrise, ending Metal Gear Solid. The credits show footage of Alaska coming to life, thriving and moving on like Snake said he would, with Gaelic chants implemented once more. In the game's introduction they were used sparsely to give off a cold, intense and detached tone, but in this instance the backing instrumental is much more naturalistic, with folky strings plucking away and tribal-esque drums to emphasize the humanity that's been found amongst the cruelty and violence of Shadow Moses. Also, of course the game isn't actually over yet. Kojima can't help but insert one final twist. We hear a one-sided call from Revolver Ocelot, in which we find out that he was in fact working for the US government the entire time, having retrieved Metal Gear's test data, in the process purposefully taking out the DARPA chief, who'd found him out, when we were under the impression that Ocelot's mortal, overzealous torture of him was a mistake. The breadcrumb of dominance and recessive genes arises again, as Liquid turns out to be the one with the dominant genes, Snake's success reaffirming that his DNA was not fatalistic, that it could be overcome. Finally, we learn that Ocelot's speaking to the third child of Big Boss, the third product of laissez-faire, Solidus, also known as the President of the United States. This is an insane twist. It's obviously doing the stereotypical "this goes all the way to the top" thing, but it also kind of reframes the whole story, with Liquid becoming the less consequential villain as Ocelot swoops in to take that role instead, having been galaxy braining everything beyond even what Liquid was doing already. It may seem like I've reached the end of the game while omitting some really important stuff, notably certain plot developments like how I skimmed over the Decoy Octopus reveal or discussion of secondary characters in general, but that was for a reason, because this final twist, as nuts as it is laced throughout the game. The foreshadowing is there to make it make sense, and that's what I want to touch on now, because when you're playing Metal Gear Solid for the first time, you don't have the knowledge required to appreciate how things are teased and hidden in plain sight. One of the earliest and most prominent cases of this is Snake's meeting with Donald Anderson, the DARPA chief. We now understand that Ocelot has purposely killed Anderson during torture to cover for the president, then telling Liquid that it was an accident. This means that Decoy Octopus has to disguise himself as the DARPA chief, and that's who we meet, not Donald Anderson. So, with Anderson dead and the terrorists missing one of the passwords they need to activate Rex, Decoy instead prods Snake to look for the PAL keys, as Liquid and crew don't possess them or know the trick to using them. This isn't just a cool thing to notice, to reappraise the scene and pick up new details and breadcrumbs, but also a part of the game's exploration of control. Snake's being manipulated in ways the player can't even appreciate until the very end of the game, and depending on what details you actually remember because of how convoluted the plot gets, you may not appreciate it until a second playthrough of the game. You also catch a lot of small instances, like Campbell and Naomi acting ignorant about Foxdie, or Liquid, as Master Miller, calling Psycho Mantis pathetic, after Mantis' dying monologue reveals that he never believed in Liquid's cause and revolution in the first place. He then does a similar thing once Sniper Wolf is dead, and these are beats that inform characterization, but can only be picked up on now. There's a hidden layer of the plot that's incredibly satisfying to reveal upon a revisit. This layer doesn't only tie into the game's core themes, furthering them along, but also reframes the player's relationship to the game as a piece of interactive software. The player is critiqued, questioned, and challenged a few times as you play, but having that knowledge going in changes you from the ignorant participant to the informed participant. The threads of self-critique that the developers have imparted become more obvious, and you can engage more intellectually and less emotionally with the whole thing. That being said, some issues arise from being that informed participant. Chief among them is just Liquid's entirely batshit plan. Because the terrorists can't actually activate Rex themselves, they need to manipulate Snake, someone on the opposition, to bring the PAL keys to them, and in the end activate Rex on their behalf. Yet, Liquid places guards all throughout the facility, fires missiles at you from a helicopter, plants invisible enemies in an elevator, and 6 Mantis, Ocelot, Sniper Wolf, and Vulcan Raven after you, seemingly with the intent of killing you. At any moment, if one thing were to go wrong, Snake would be dead and the terrorists would be fucked. It's a logistical nightmare that completely falls apart when scrutinized retroactively. There is an aspect of performance to it. I suppose having no obstacles at all would make Campbell and Foxhound in general suspicious, but the reality is Liquid was doing way too much. That being said, you could look at it from more of a thematic, symbolic level. Liquid, with his fatalistic outlook, possibly believes he understands Snake completely due to their shared DNA, and so is able, almost, to walk the tightrope of testing him but not ending him. This does play into the clear bitterness Liquid harbours for Snake, thinking he's inherited the dominant genes, and so maybe he does want to punish and hurt him at least a bit before Rex is activated. Regardless though, that doesn't discount the clear logistical holes that feel like glaring exclusions considering the effort taken to make sure the twist-ridden plot does still hold up under scrutiny. Now, to get to side characters. I didn't discuss Nastasha and Mei Ling all that much earlier as they don't really affect the core plot, but they're still worth covering. Mei Ling acts as a really good neutralizer. As the person who facilitates saving, she takes on this sort of innocent and pure role. She never lies to Snake, not even by omission I believe, and is a steady hand, moving in step with the emotional stakes. She's a true support person and is essential to balancing out the overall tone of the cast. Nastasha is your advisor for weapons and equipment, explaining how different guns or items you pick up function. There's a great level of detail in the descriptions, playing into the game's love-hate relationship with weaponry. She embodies this even further as her other role is to essentially be the writer's soapbox character. Oftentimes when you call, she'll take the chance to go on a little rant about how nuclear weapons are bad and how the world's superpowers have been lying about their efforts to deproliferate nukes and nuclear material. Even if this stuff does get a bit redundant with her, it stays true to the game's fascinating tone, which uses precise military reality as a base from which to build its own world and circumstances. The two more blatant gaps I left were Miller and Naomi. There's not really much to say about Miller, he's just a vector for another twist. The info he provides can be interesting but not as relevant to narrative and gameplay as Nastasha's is. That being said, you will pick up details that tip you off to the fact that it's actually liquid, like right in the beginning when he talks about mice killing the offspring of different gene pools to preserve their own DNA and bloodline. Which brings us to Naomi. The subplot with Naomi and Grey Fox is probably my favourite part of the game's story, because of how emotionally dialed in it is, but also how much it benefits from another look through. When you know that Grey Fox is Naomi's brother, you appreciate Jennifer Hale's performance as her so much more. When Snake calls Grey Fox a friend, Naomi's reaction at first feels like mild surprise that someone like Snake would even have a friend, but going through a second time you catch how charged her silence and shock is as she contemplates if the man she spent 2 years hoping to kill is really the villain she thought.
I learned a lot from him.
But didn't you try to kill each other?
Her precise, kind of posh voice mellows out and warms up at certain points in this conversation as well, as a fucked up family life is what connects them to each other. There are a bunch of these moments where a small vocalization like a sharp breath, a sigh, or just a moment of silence becomes so much more from Naomi. They're the small parts of her inner struggle that slip out through the gaps in her front, all of which revolve around the most tortured person in these games so far, Grey Fox, who, as I said, is made into an example of all the game's themes. It's a testament to not just the writing but the voice cast. It's seriously so impressive for the time. To me, the original PlayStation 1 version of Metal Gear Solid is always the iteration people should play first, but I do believe that doing a second playthrough is very important for truly getting the most out of the game because of how the experience changes as I've just outlined. And for that second playthrough, I'd recommend the GameCube remake Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes. The Twin Snakes is pretty contentious and it seems its reception has kind of soured further over time, but I think it's well worth checking out. The biggest issue people take with it is all the changes, but those things don't really matter if you go through the Twin Snakes as your second playthrough, because by then you will have gotten the true experience already in the PS1 version. On the gameplay side, things were updated to generally be in parity with MGS2, which meant the addition of first-person aiming, lockers to hide in, the ability to hang off different walkways and level geometry, and more. These things all make the game considerably easier, but again, that's not so much an issue when you're playing primarily to recontextualize the story. It also allowed for some streamlined design, like being able to heat up and cool down the PAL key in the underground base itself, cutting out the backtracking. The music has also been changed. The new material isn't bad, and some is just reinterpreting cuts from the original game, but in my opinion it proves inferior in many cases. For example, the samples feel more naturalistic in the Twin Snakes, like actual vocals are being sung, but that was part of the original soundtrack I liked, incorporating the lies and artificiality of the Shadow Moses incident itself. Staying on the presentation, I'm really not a fan of the character models in this iteration either. The looks in MGS2 are so iconic and definitive that the differences here just make them look like knockoffs. Otacon in particular with his pointy nose and almost cartoonishly Poindexter appearance. In terms of presentation though, and probably the entire game, people take the most issue with the cutscenes. Which it makes sense. They were directed by Ryuhei Kitamura, a Japanese director working primarily in the action and horror genres. As such, the cutscenes are acrobatic, Matrix-esque, and over the top to an absurd degree, at times undermining character work as well with how people are portrayed. They probably reach their height when Snake jumps off a rocket Liquid fires at him so he can aim his own rocket at the helicopter to finally take him down. I get why people think this is too much. It doesn't feel as purposeful as Kojima's camera work, but again, when you're just there for a new perspective on the writing, it becomes great fun to laugh at. There is also a metatextual level as well, where the original Metal Gear Solid is almost actively misinterpreted so that the macho warmongering is brought to the fore, the developers' concerns that they're just reproducing war and conflict themselves coming true. Playing through the Twin Snakes can still be tons of fun, and I think is a really fascinating companion to the PS1 original that shouldn't be dismissed for not being a one-to-one recreation. The importance of Metal Gear Solid has been restated so much in the last 25 years that it becomes easy to imagine that surely, by now, all of its innovation has been internalized by the game industry, and that in the process some of its luster has been lost. But that inclination is wrong. MGS is still subversive, compelling, and complex in a way most games just aren't. We see this the most in its narrative, which well and truly begins spinning the web that will build the rest of the series' complex history. Its central focus on genes is a fantastic base off which to build out the rest of its themes. It naturally splinters off into the ideas of control, power, military domination, determinism, historical analysis, and way more. It does so with levels of complexity that have implicative ramifications ranging from interpersonal relationships to the operation of global superpowers. It can get verbose and wordy, but manages to strike a pretty satisfying structure where the mystery and tension is held taut while still giving you some answers. Despite being so rich in subject matter and discussion, character remains very important the entire way through. There's a clear love and empathy held for each member of the cast, making way for a level of maturity rarely seen in games writing at the time. The script can be resonant, affecting, and engaging on a personal level, building investment via the two-pronged approach of Snake, where we at once relate to him while allowing him to be his own person. There's also a varied tone of voice. Humour and levity are given their space, and so you end up having fully formed conceptions of these people that feel genuine and authentic. This is all then folded back onto the player, who's forced to contend with their role in it all as the facilitator. The game's themes are externalized beyond the screen, using enchanting mechanical turns and breaks of the fourth wall to do so. But despite how effusive I've been in regards to the writing, it no doubt has its faults. There's obvious care taken to make sure the mystery and plot twists are foreshadowed, but Liquid's central plan is full of gaps. Then there's the writing of women in general, which works within a limited emotional range, evocative of a regressive or perhaps stagnant view of gender held by the writers. Fortunately, the gameplay and presentation backs up the narrative moves. The stealth systems are inherently anti-war, with the scenario and level design recalling moments from Metal Gear 1 and 2 again and again, bringing the illusion of control to the forefront. It's also just satisfying to sneak past guards, and you're given a diverse suite of tools that all come into use between normal sneaking and boss fights. Some boss fights, well, probably most boss fights, do fall short, and there's some straight up bad level design, but for the most part the gameplay experience is fleshed out, mechanically layered, and plotted to create a satisfying arc of power and accomplishment. The presentation mirrors much of that. The voice acting is just really fucking great, and even more so for the time, bringing so much personality and further depth to the characters. It's just fun to watch them interact and unravel. The music is diverse, in particular playing with the human element via vocal samples to push and pull emphasis around the humanity of the situation. Some tracks are minimalist mood pieces and others are more overbearing, soundtracking your silent footsteps behind guards. What unifies them is a tonal identity built off reverberation and repetition. There's space in practically every song, with different elements bouncing off the walls of Shadow Moses itself in a sense. The soundtrack communicates an incredibly rich sense of place, helping ground the game in some ways while still bending enough to offer drama and grandeur in more momentous moments, typically during cutscenes. The camera and filmic technique generally is also used to great effect. It's quite dynamic, shifting in its tone and place to communicate action in a readable but engaging way. It characterizes cutscenes in step with a narrative tone and direction to visually communicate the script. There's also the graphics and graphical design choices in general. The 3D models are proportionate and that perfect in-between of lifelike but distinctly polygonal. The textures, by their 32-bit nature, afford a grit and grime to Shadow Moses that only sells it more. The exterior is suffocated by a low render distance to emphasize how trapped Snake is. Yoji Shinkawa's art is put to great use as well. The briefing sequences, cover art and title screen have a signature style, made up of vague instinctual brushstrokes that make each character look wispy and fragile. Characters meld into one another, and their piercing, sharp features, along with their muscular bodies, play into the nuance and complexity found in this hardened industry. Most notably, there's the title screen, Snake, overlaid with code, lost amongst it all. That's the game. That's what happens. The fact that the narrative themes are so self-evident, so well applied through not just writing but gameplay, design, soundtrack, presentation, is incredible. It's part of what makes Metal Gear Solid the subversive masterpiece that it still is today. MGS had something to say in a way very little art had before it, and I'm really glad it said it.